same man. 2 Sundays. In one version, you wake up late. No alarm, no urgency. You stretch, check your phone, maybe ignore it. You head to the gym when you feel like it, grab coffee after, sit somewhere quiet and decide what the rest of the day looks like in real time. Nothing is scheduled, nothing is owed. The day belongs to you. In the other version, your eyes open earlier than you want, not because you chose to, but because something needs to be done. Groceries, a family visit, plans that were made days ago. You're moving, but not freely. Every hour already has a purpose, and most of those purposes weren't entirely yours. You're present, responsible, dependable, but not fully in control. Same man, 2 lives. One feels like he is choosing his life. The other feels like his life has already been chosen for him. And here's the uncomfortable question that more men are starting to ask, quietly, without announcing it to the world. Why does one path feel like expansion, while the other slowly feels like contraction? This isn't about blaming women. It's not about rejecting connection, loyalty, or building something meaningful with another person. It's about something far more subtle and far more personal. It's about what happens to a man's sense of control, identity, and internal peace once his life is no longer entirely his own. You see it more often now. Men delaying marriage, some opting out entirely. Not because they can't commit, but because they're starting to calculate the cost more carefully than before. And the cost isn't always obvious at the beginning, because on the surface, marriage looks like an upgrade, stability, partnership, shared goals. But beneath that structure, there are quiet trade-offs that don't show up in romantic conversations or wedding speeches. Trade-offs that only become visible once you're already inside. And most men don't notice them all at once. It happens gradually. Small adjustments, minor compromises, tiny permissions asked here and there, until one day you realize something has shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but permanently. And it usually starts with something so small it feels almost harmless, until it isn't. It doesn't begin with something dramatic. No one wakes up one day and feels like they've lost control of their life. It starts smaller than that, almost invisible. You begin by adjusting little things: where you go, who you meet, what you spend. At first, it feels like consideration, like respect. You check in, you align, you coordinate. It feels mature, responsible. But over time, those small check-ins become expectations. You hesitate before making decisions that used to be automatic. You think twice before saying yes to a last-minute plan. You start explaining your choices, not just making them. And without realizing it, your life begins to move through a filter that wasn't there before. This is where the shift happens. Quietly. You're still an adult. You still have the ability to decide. But the experience of deciding changes. It no longer feels unilateral. It feels negotiated, even in areas that once belonged entirely to you. And here's the paradox most men don't expect. You grow older, more capable, more established. Yet your day-to-day autonomy subtly decreases. Not because someone is controlling you in an obvious way, but because the structure of partnership introduces shared authority into every corner of your life. You gain a partner, but you lose something else in exchange: the ability to act without consideration. And at first, that sounds fair, even necessary, because relationships require alignment. They require compromise. But what many men don't anticipate is how deeply that compromise extends into the smallest decisions. Micro-autonomy starts to erode. You don't feel it all at once. It accumulates. One adjusted plan, one delayed decision, one moment of "I'll check first." Over time, these moments stack up until your natural instinct to act freely becomes replaced by a habit of seeking alignment. And the most interesting part, Many men don't recognize this shift until much later. Not because they lack awareness, but because nothing feels wrong on the surface. Life still functions. Responsibilities are met. The relationship appears stable, but internally, something feels different, less spontaneous, less self-directed, less yours. And once you start noticing it, it becomes difficult to ignore, because it raises a deeper question you can't easily answer. If you have to continuously adjust your decisions to fit the structure, at what point does the structure begin to redefine who you are? Then comes the layer most men underestimate until it's already in motion: money. Before commitment, your income feels direct. You earn, you decide, you spend. There's a clear line between effort and reward. You can take risks, invest in yourself, waste a little, save aggressively, or change direction entirely without needing consensus. The feedback loop is simple. Your life responds to your choices. After commitment, that line starts to blur. Income becomes shared. Not always officially at first, but practically. Decisions around spending are no longer just about what you want or what makes sense to you. They're about what aligns with us. Large purchases require agreement. Even smaller ones begin to carry a sense of justification. Not because you're incapable of deciding, but because the system now expects coordination. And again, it sounds reasonable. It is reasonable, but there's a hidden shift in control. Your money is still yours, but it doesn't feel entirely yours anymore. You start thinking in terms of combined outcomes instead of individual strategy. You become more conservative, more cautious, not necessarily because you've changed internally, but because the margin for independent error shrinks. Every financial move now has a wider impact. Then there's the entry cost. Weddings, living arrangements, shared responsibilities. These aren't small adjustments. They demand upfront investment, sometimes significant. For many men, this means starting a long-term commitment already carrying financial pressure. Not collapse-level pressure, but enough to influence decisions early. And pressure changes behavior. You delay risks. You prioritize stability. You think twice before making moves that once felt natural. Career changes, business ideas, relocation. These become heavier decisions, not just because they affect you, but because they affect the structure you're now responsible for maintaining. Here's where the perspective quietly shifts. Some men begin to question whether the traditional structure still makes practical sense in a modern context. Not emotionally, but strategically. Because many of the benefits once tied to marriage, companionship, support, shared living, can now be accessed in different ways without the same level of long-term financial entanglement. It's not about avoiding responsibility. It's about evaluating cost versus control. And when that evaluation becomes honest, it leads to an uncomfortable realization. The more financially intertwined your life becomes, the less flexible your future tends to be. Not impossible to change, just harder. And once flexibility starts to decrease, something else begins to fade with it. Something that has nothing to do with money, but everything to do with how a man experiences his own space. At some point, it stops feeling like your space, not suddenly. Not in a way you can point to and say, this is where it changed. It happens through gradual adjustments, a different couch, a new layout, decorations you wouldn't have chosen, but you agreed to, colors, objects, arrangements that reflect compromise instead of personal instinct. And again, none of this feels unreasonable. You're building a shared environment. Of course, it shouldn't look like it belongs to only one person, but over time, something subtle begins to disappear. The sense that this place is an extension of you. Before, your space had a certain raw honesty to it. It reflected your habits, your preferences, your rhythm. It didn't need approval. It didn't need explanation. It simply existed as a physical representation of how you lived. Now it becomes curated, balanced, adjusted, negotiated. You don't place things exactly where you want them anymore. You place them where they make sense for both. You don't organize your environment purely for function, you organize it for agreement. And while that sounds like maturity, it carries a psychological cost that most men don't anticipate. Because your environment isn't just where you live, it's where you reset. It's where you think clearly, recover energy, and reconnect with yourself. When that space no longer feels fully yours, even if you technically live there, something shifts internally. You start to feel like a participant in your own environment, rather than the owner of it. You live there, but it doesn't feel like it belongs to you. That sentence doesn't hit immediately. It builds over time. And it's not about control in a possessive sense. It's about identity. A man's space has always been one of the few places where he doesn't have to negotiate who he is. When that becomes shared territory in every sense, that freedom quietly dissolves. Even your routines begin to adapt when you wake up. How you unwind, what you watch, when you sleep. These things slowly align with someone else's rhythm. And while alignment creates harmony on the surface, it can also create distance from your own natural pace underneath. You adjust enough times and eventually you stop noticing that you're adjusting at all. It just becomes normal. But normal doesn't always mean neutral. Because when your external space no longer reflects your internal state, a gap forms. Small at first, then more noticeable. And once that gap appears, it doesn't stay isolated. It starts to extend beyond your home, into the way you spend your time, the people you see, and the parts of yourself you gradually stop feeding. It doesn't happen in one clean break. You don't wake up and suddenly lose your friends, your routines, or the things that used to define your time. It's slower than that, more subtle. It fades. At first, you just miss a few things. A gym session gets skipped because something else came up. A weekend plan with friends gets postponed. A hobby you used to enjoy becomes something you'll get back to later. And later keeps moving further away, not because you don't care, but because something else always takes priority. Your schedule begins to fill with obligations that weren't there before. Family gatherings, social events connected to your partner, dinners, visits, celebrations, things you didn't necessarily choose, but now participate in because that's part of maintaining the relationship. And again, none of this feels wrong. It feels like responsibility, like integration, like building a shared life. But here's what most men don't anticipate. Every new obligation doesn't just add something. It replaces something. Time is limited. So when new social circles enter your life, older ones quietly get pushed out. You see your friends less. Conversations become shorter, less frequent. Eventually, they become occasional check-ins instead of a consistent presence. No conflict, no falling out, just distance. And the same thing happens with your personal interests. The things that once gave you energy, training, gaming, creating, learning, start to shrink in importance. Not because they lost value, but because they're no longer prioritized in the same way. They become optional instead of essential, something you do if there's time. And there's almost never time. Over months, sometimes years, this creates a quiet form of isolation. Not physical isolation. You're surrounded by people more than ever. But internally, something feels reduced. Less expression, less individuality, less connection to the parts of your life that were chosen purely because you wanted them. You're still functioning, still social, still engaged, but in a different way, a more filtered way. And here's the part most men don't say out loud. When you lose consistent contact with your own circle, your perspective begins to narrow. You hear fewer honest reflections. You experience less friction from people who knew you before all of this. And without that, it becomes easier to adapt, even when the adaptation isn't entirely aligned with who you used to be. not worse, not better, just different. And over time, that difference accumulates into something bigger than just missed hangouts or skipped workouts. It becomes a shift in identity. Because when your time, your energy, and your attention are constantly redirected outward, you eventually start to forget what your life felt like when it was centered around you. And that's where another realization begins to surface. One that challenges everything you thought marriage would feel like in the first place. Before commitment, the picture is simple. You imagine continuity. What do you feel during the relationship? Connection, attraction, ease. You assume it will carry forward. Maybe not perfectly, but close enough. You believe the dynamic you built together will remain the foundation. Because why wouldn't it? You chose each other. There was alignment. There was chemistry. There was a sense that things just worked. But after the structure becomes permanent, something shifts, not instantly, but inevitably. The context changes. What used to be optional becomes expected. What used to feel natural begins to feel required. Roles start to form, even if no one explicitly defines them. Responsibilities expand. And slowly, the relationship stops being just about connection and starts becoming about function. You're no longer just a man in a relationship. You're a husband, a provider, a stabilizer, a decision maker under constraint. And with that shift, expectations evolve. Not always communicated directly, but felt. How you behave, how you respond, what you prioritize, what you tolerate. These things begin to adjust, not necessarily because you want them to, but because the structure around you demands consistency. And consistency can quietly replace authenticity if you're not careful. The version of you that once felt spontaneous, relaxed, and fully expressed begins to tighten. Not disappear, but adapt. You become more measured, more careful, more aware of consequences. Again, none of this is inherently negative, but it's different from what you imagined. Because what most men expect is that love will remain the core experience. What they encounter instead is that responsibility begins to take up more space than they anticipated. And over time, that creates tension, not always visible, not always discussed, but present, because there's a gap between the version of the relationship you believed you were entering and the version you're actually living. And inside that gap, something starts to erode. Your sense of individuality, not in a dramatic way. You still exist. You still think, act, decide. But more of your life begins to revolve around maintaining the structure than expressing yourself within it. Schedules become shared. Priorities become aligned. Decisions become collective. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, your life stops orbiting around your own center. It orbits around the system you've built together. For some, that feels fulfilling. For others, it feels like a quiet loss. Because when too much of your identity becomes tied to roles and expectations, a question begins to surface. One that's difficult to ignore once it appears. Are you still living your life? Or are you maintaining one? At a certain point, it's no longer about adjustment. It becomes about limitation. Not the kind that's forced onto you, but the kind you accept, because the cost of breaking it feels too high. You start thinking differently about risk. Before, changing jobs, moving cities, starting something uncertain, it all felt like expansion. Even failure had a contained impact. You could recover, recalibrate, try again. Your decisions affected you, and that made you faster, sharper, more willing to move. Now, every decision carries weight beyond you. It's not just what do I want to do. It becomes what happens if this goes wrong, and that question doesn't just live in your head. It influences your behavior. So you stabilize. You choose predictability over possibility. You stay in roles longer than you should. You tolerate situations you once would have walked away from. Not because you've lost ambition, but because the consequences of disruption are no longer isolated. You become careful, and careful, over time, can turn into stagnant. This is where many men begin to feel something they can't easily explain. Not dissatisfaction exactly, not regret in a clear sense, but a quiet sense of being contained. You've invested too much to move freely. Time, energy, money, identity. It's all tied into the structure. And walking away doesn't just mean change, it means loss, real loss. Financially, the exit is heavy. Legal processes, divided assets, long negotiations. What took years to build can fracture quickly, but not cleanly. There's friction in every direction. Mentally, it's even more complex, because leaving doesn't reset you to who you were before. It leaves you disoriented, questioning your decisions, replaying where things shifted. And often, without fully understanding the patterns, men step back into similar dynamics again, not because they want to repeat the mistake, but because they never fully saw it the first time. So they stay, not always out of happiness, sometimes out of calculation, sometimes out of responsibility, sometimes simply because the alternative feels more uncertain than the current discomfort. And this is the part rarely discussed openly, that for some men, commitment doesn't feel like growth. It feels like containment disguised as stability. And once that realization settles in, it changes how you see everything that comes next, including the idea that there might be another way to live entirely, one that doesn't require you to trade as much as you think. So more men are starting to choose differently, not loudly, not in rebellion, just quietly stepping away from a path that no longer feels aligned. They're not rejecting connection. They're not avoiding responsibility. What they're protecting is something more fundamental: control over their time, their energy, and the direction of their own life. Because when you strip everything down, that's what matters most. Time you can allocate without negotiation. Money you can deploy without friction. Space that reflects who you are without compromise. A life that moves at your pace, not one constantly adjusted to maintain balance. And for many, that version of life feels cleaner, lighter, more direct. It doesn't mean isolation. You can still build relationships. You can still care deeply, invest emotionally, and create meaningful bonds. But those bonds are chosen continuously, not locked in by structure. They exist because both people want to be there, not because they're obligated to stay. That distinction changes everything, because when presence is voluntary, respect tends to remain intact. When it becomes enforced by commitment, dynamics can shift in ways most people don't anticipate. This isn't about saying marriage is wrong. It's about understanding that it only works under specific conditions. Conditions most people never define clearly before stepping into it. If a man chooses it, he needs to know exactly what he's building. Not just emotionally, but practically. He needs clarity in his direction, stability in his identity, and boundaries that don't disappear under pressure. Without that, the structure will shape him more than he shapes it. And that's where the real principle sits. You don't enter a commitment to complete your life. You enter it only if your life is already complete on its own. Because if you rely on the structure to give you purpose, direction, or identity, you'll eventually become dependent on something you no longer control. But if you build your life first, fully, independently, then any connection you choose becomes an addition, not a replacement. And that's the difference most men are starting to recognize, quietly, gradually, without needing validation. Because at the end of the day, the question isn't whether commitment is good or bad. It's whether the version of it you're stepping into is costing you more than you're willing to give. If it demands your freedom, your identity, and your internal peace in exchange, then it's not a partnership. It's a transaction you didn't fully understand when you agreed to it.
The strongest people you know are not strong because life was easy on them. They're strong because life hit them, repeatedly, and they had no other option but to keep moving. But here's what nobody talks about. All that pain didn't just leave scars. It changed how they think, how they trust, how they love, and how they see the world. And most of them have no idea it's happening. Today, we're going over 9 traits that show up in people who have been through a lot. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand why some of the people closest to you act the way they do, including, maybe, yourself. Pain does something to a person. It literally rewires the brain. Psychologists have studied this for decades, and what they found is that when someone goes through prolonged suffering, whether that's childhood trauma, loss, emotional abuse, or just years of things going wrong, the brain adapts. It changes its settings. It starts making decisions differently, and those changes don't disappear when the hard times are over. They stick around. They keep running in the background, like an app you forgot to close, eating up energy, influencing everything. And here's the problem that makes all of this so complicated. Most people who carry this kind of pain don't look like they're carrying it. They function, they show up, they help everyone around them, they make people laugh, they have it together, or at least they look like they do. And because they appear fine, nobody checks on them, nobody digs deeper. So these traits just keep going unnoticed, unaddressed, shaping every relationship and every decision without anyone, including the person themselves, really understanding what's driving it. So, let's get into it. These 9 traits, one by one. And as we go, pay attention, because some of these might describe someone in your life more accurately than you think. The first one is that people who have suffered a lot expect bad things to happen, even when everything is going well. You've probably seen this. You give someone good news, and instead of being happy, their brain immediately jumps to everything that could go wrong. They get a promotion, and their first thought is, what if I fail at it? They fall in love, and instead of enjoying it, they're already bracing for heartbreak. Psychologists have a name for this. It's called negative future projection, and it comes directly from repeated painful experiences. When your brain has been caught off guard by pain enough times, it stops waiting to be surprised. It starts expecting pain as the default. It figures that if it stays ready for the worst, it won't be blindsided again. The problem is that this defense mechanism makes it incredibly hard to actually enjoy good moments. Those moments arrive, and instead of landing, they just pass by, because the person is too busy scanning the horizon for the next bad thing. Now that connects directly into the second trait, and this one is tricky, because it actually looks like a strength from the outside. People who've been through a lot tend to become hyper-independent. They do everything themselves. They don't ask for help. They figure things out alone, carry problems alone, and honestly, they get really good at it. But here's what's actually going on underneath that independence. At some point, depending on someone led to real disappointment. Maybe they needed someone and that person wasn't there. Maybe asking for help was used against them. Maybe love felt conditional. So over time, they learned, consciously or not, that needing people is a risk, and they stopped taking it. So now they're incredibly capable, incredibly self-sufficient, and incredibly lonely, because genuine connection requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is exactly the thing they've spent years learning to avoid. And speaking of vulnerability, this leads us to the third trait, which is one most people never connect to suffering. They overthink everything. A text message that goes unanswered for 2 hours turns into a mental spiral. Did I say something wrong? Are they upset with me? Did I come on too strong? A friend's tone of voice shifts slightly, and they're replaying the last 3 conversations, trying to find the moment things went off track. A pause in a conversation feels loaded. This is called hypervigilance, and it's a survival mechanism. If you grew up, or spent years, in an environment where things could shift suddenly, where moods were unpredictable, where safety felt temporary, your brain learned to stay alert at all times. It trained itself to catch early signs of danger before danger arrived, and the brain is really good at learning. The problem is, it doesn't automatically unlearn things just because the environment changes. So now, even in completely safe situations, that scanner is still running. It's looking for threats that aren't there, and it is exhausting. Not just for the person, but for everyone around them who can't understand why they seem so on edge all the time. All right, quick check-in. Do you recognize any of these in yourself or in someone you know? Drop a comment below. Seriously, you might be surprised how many people watching this right now are nodding along and feeling like someone finally put words to something they couldn't explain. Let's keep going. The fourth trait is one that can push people away without them ever meaning to, and that's that people who have suffered a lot have an incredibly hard time trusting, not just romantically, in every area. Friends, family, co-workers, even strangers. Trust for them is not given freely. It has to be earned, slowly, through consistent actions, over a long period of time. And even after someone has earned it, there's always a small, quiet part of them waiting for something to go wrong, waiting to be let down. This is not them being difficult or paranoid or cold. This is their nervous system doing exactly what it was trained to do, because at some point, they trusted someone completely, and that person broke it. And that kind of betrayal doesn't just hurt in the moment. It changes how the brain processes safety in relationships for a long time after. Now here's the fifth trait, and this one might actually surprise you. People who have been through a lot tend to carry deep, persistent guilt, and not just about things they've done. They feel guilty about things that have nothing to do with them. Someone cancels plans because they're sick, and the person with this trait spends the rest of the day wondering if they did something to make that person not want to see them. They apologize constantly, sometimes several times for the same small thing, sometimes for things that are clearly outside of their control. Therapists call this maladaptive guilt, and it usually traces back to early experiences where a person was made to feel like they were the problem, like their presence was too much, like things that happened around them were somehow caused by them. So they grew up with this deep-seated belief that they owe the world something, that they need to be smaller, quieter, more accommodating, just to be acceptable. Here's what makes this even more interesting, and this is something most people don't know. Research actually shows that people who carry this kind of guilt tend to be significantly more empathetic than average. They feel other people's pain deeply. They notice when someone is off, even when no one else does. But, and this is important, that same empathy makes them more likely to stay in toxic situations far longer than they should. Because they keep thinking, if I just try a little harder, if I just give a little more, things will get better. Keep that in mind. It connects directly to something we're going to talk about in a few minutes. The sixth trait is one that can actually be beautiful, but it comes with a cost. People who have suffered deeply feel emotions much more intensely than most people. A piece of music can bring them to tears out of nowhere. A sad story doesn't just make them a little emotional, it hits them in the chest and lingers for hours. But it also goes the other way. When something makes them angry, it's not just irritation, it's a wave. When they feel joy, it's real and it's deep. When they feel betrayal, it can feel like the ground gave out. Psychologists connect this to emotional dysregulation, which basically means the brain's emotional processing system got disrupted at some point, either because feelings were constantly overwhelming or because they were constantly suppressed. Both things break the dial. So now it goes from 0 to 100 without much in between. And that can feel like too much, both for the person experiencing it and for the people around them who don't understand where that intensity is coming from. And here's something to sit with before we move on. That emotional intensity, that depth of feeling, is directly connected to the seventh trait, because people who have been through a lot are usually the most fiercely loyal people you will ever meet. When they love you hard. They remember the things you mentioned once in passing. They show up, they check in, they'll rearrange their entire schedule to be there for you at a bad moment, because they know from personal experience what it feels like to reach out and have no one there, what it feels like to cry in a quiet room with nowhere to put it. So they make a decision, often unconsciously, to be for the people they care about what no one was for them. The problem is that level of loyalty isn't always matched. And because they tend to see the best in people, because they want to believe the good is there even when the signs are pointing elsewhere, they give that loyalty to people who don't deserve it. They stay too long. They forgive too many times. Not because they lack self-respect, but because they genuinely believe people can change, and because leaving feels like abandonment, and they know too well how abandonment feels. Let me ask you something. Have you ever stayed in a friendship, a relationship, a situation, way past the point you should have, because you kept feeling responsible for making it work? Because leaving felt like giving up on someone. That is not weakness. That might just be the mark of someone who has felt more than their fair share. Now the eighth trait, this one genuinely surprises people. A lot of people who have been through serious pain develop a very dark, very sharp, and very quick sense of humor. They laugh at things that make other people uncomfortable. They joke about their own struggles in a way that catches people off guard. They can sit with heavy, dark topics without flinching, and people either love this about them or don't quite know what to do with it. But here's why it happens. Humor is one of the most effective coping mechanisms the human brain has. When you've experienced something painful, turning it into a joke gives you a small sense of control over it. It takes something that could crush you and makes it survivable. Psychologists actually call this gallows humor, and it's considered a marker of psychological resilience. It means the brain found a way to process pain without collapsing under it, but it also works as armor, because if you're laughing, nobody thinks to ask if you're actually okay. And for someone who has been carrying things alone for a long time, that armor is very, very comfortable. Which brings us to the 9th trait, and I think this is the most important one in the whole video. People who have been through a lot are often incredibly strong on the surface, but completely starved for real, genuine connection underneath. They built this version of themselves that handles things, that functions, that looks like they're fine, and they wear it so naturally, for so long, that the world just believes it. Their friends believe it. Their family believes it. Sometimes even they believe it. But inside, what they want more than anything is for someone to actually see past that, to look at them and ask, not as a formality, not as small talk, but genuinely, are you actually okay? And to stay for the answer. Here's what ties all 9 of these traits together, and this is the part I really want you to hear. Every single one of them, the overthinking, the independence, the loyalty, the guilt, the dark humor, the emotional intensity, the mistrust, every one of them started as protection. The brain was trying to survive something hard, and for a long time, it worked. These traits kept them going. But protection that stays switched on forever eventually becomes a cage, because now they're in a different chapter of their life, but the old settings are still running. The brain hasn't gotten the memo that things have changed, and that's what makes healing so difficult for people who carry a lot of pain. It's not about fixing something broken, it's about gently teaching a very smart, very protective brain that it doesn't need to fight so hard anymore, that it's allowed to rest, that not every person is a threat, and not every good moment is just calm before a storm. This is why one person, just one, who truly sees them, can change everything. Not with advice, not with solutions, just with presence, just with staying, just with choosing to know them past the surface. If someone came to mind while you were watching this, reach out to them today. You don't need a reason, you don't need the right words. Just say you were thinking about them. That's it. Because for someone who has spent years feeling invisible, being remembered, out of nowhere, for no reason, is more powerful than you know. And if you recognize yourself in this video, I want you to hear this clearly. The fact that you made it through everything that shaped these traits, that is not a small thing. That is everything. The way you adapted, the way you kept going when you had real reasons not to, that's not something to be ashamed of. The work now is just learning to live in a way that matches where you actually are, not where you've been. And that starts with understanding yourself, which is exactly what you just did. If this made you understand yourself or someone else a little better, there's a lot more like this waiting for you here.